Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We thank you for being present with us today as we once again discuss cannabis at this Cannabis Symposium. The RSA, or the Regulated Substances Authority, is very happy to have you here today in the audience, and we'd like to also welcome our online audience to be with us today. On our panel today, we have with us Mr. Dylan Norbert Inglis, who is the CEO of the Regulatory Authority here in St. Lucia. We also have with us Ms. Farah Blake, the CEO of the Cannabis Licensing Authority of Jamaica. We have with us Ms. Simone Jacobs, Senior Inspector of the Medicinal Cannabis Authority of St. Vincent. And a little bit later online, we'll be joined by Mr. Regis Burton, who is the CEO of the Cannabis Authority of Antigua and Barbuda, for us to discuss all things cannabis here in the region. Before we begin this discussion, we're going to invite Ms. Rosemary Pierre-Louis to give the opening remarks, who is the Director of the Board of Directors of the RSA St. Lucia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. Let me wish all of you a pleasant good afternoon or early evening. On behalf of our CEO of the Regulated Substances Board, I would like to welcome each and every one of you present here this evening. I know it's difficult after 8 hours of work to come and share your views and to sit down and give us your professional opinion on the cannabis and industrial hemp bill. The authority has held a series of discussions on the bill. I believe we held about 7 of them across St. Lucia. We have gathered feedback, and this evening we will be presenting you with some of the feedback received, and we also give you an opportunity to give us your own feedback on the bill. We welcome representatives from the head table, from St. Vincent, and also from Jamaica. And we are very happy for you all to be here with us to share your views and your expertise, because we are almost the new kid on the block. And as a region, we want to ensure that we get it right, or as close to right as possible. So on behalf of our chairperson, on behalf of the authority, I welcome each and every one of you here this evening. We are no strangers. I look back and I see persons from when we started the journey, and we are close to the end. Okay, so welcome, and feel free to give your honest and frank feedback. It is an opportunity for us to get it, as I said, as close to right as possible. So welcome, one and all.
Thank you, Ms. Pierre-Louis. So, cannabis has been a plant which has been much maligned in the last 50 years. However, if we go way back many decades, centuries ago, cannabis was a plant that was used in many different societies and has shown to have a lot of different uses over time. For some reason, it became a plant which was decided was no longer a plant that should be used by people and was considered a very dangerous drug. Today we've noticed that we've come around full circle, and a lot of the jurisdictions that led the charge in the making cannabis illegal, a plant that should not be used for any purpose whatsoever, have embraced the cannabis plant, leading to where we are today, where the legalization of cannabis is being discussed and is being implemented in many regions. So I'd like to start with our dear colleagues out of Jamaica and St. Vincent, who have gone ahead and legalized medicinal cannabis, and have started the industries for some time now. So, to our Jamaican colleague, Miss Blake, can you tell us how has been the Jamaican experience thus far?
Thank you, Kurt. Good evening, everyone. It is my esteemed pleasure to be here in St. Lucia again to share with you. The cannabis experience in Jamaica has been, let me say, it's decades old, but the decriminalization of cannabis came in 2015. And with that was the establishment of a board and the Cannabis Licensing Authority. The role and function of the Cannabis Licensing Authority is to issue licenses, to monitor licensed facilities to ensure that they are in keeping with the legislation and regulation and the terms and conditions of which they are licensed. So it's been about 10 years. We've issued about 170 licenses. We have licenses in categories of cultivators, retailers, processing, research and development, transport. We have establishments wherein you can consume on the property and wherein you're not allowed to consume on property. So we have a myriad of license offerings for anyone who wants to participate within the regulated framework. We have had our challenges, of course. We've had challenges with, in terms of stakeholder relations, differing views and opinions as to how the industry should operate. We've had challenges with our licensees, understanding the legislation and the regulations, and it is really our responsibility to ensure that they understand it and understand the local and international obligations under which the authority has to abide. One of the greatest things, though, is that we have come to a place now where we are not enforcers under our parent ministry, which is the Ministry of Industry, Investment and Commerce. We have been given the mandate to look at our industry as a business-friendly space. And so it has proven, it has been fruitful in the sense that we are compliance focused and we're not enforcement focused. We offer education because not everybody who comes into the cannabis industry understands the plant in the way that they ought to. Some people may see it as a business venture, and because they see it that way, they don't necessarily understand the delicacy of the plant. And so we have within the Cannabis Licensing Authority a unit called the Cannabis Specialization Unit, and their only function is to visit our cultivator sites and to share knowledge and insight on how to grow, how to clone, how to look for fungi, how to treat fungi, how to ensure that you get the best possible harvest each time. So we have found that that has helped us tremendously because now we're working together. So we're not the enforcers of the law. We are partners in your business. Partners in the sense that we offer you the advice that you don't necessarily have, that you may have to pay a consultant, maybe millions of dollars in some cases to get. So we found that that has been helpful, and we have made some significant changes to our operations. We're at the point now where we can actually do remote monitoring, so we don't have to always go to the farms to visit our licensees. They are fully familiar with their terms and conditions, and if there's a question, if there's a concern, they will always reach out to us. So our experience has been good. We've had our challenges, but one of the things that we have done continuously is to push the message that we all want the same thing. We want your business to be successful. We want you to be the trailblazers in this industry. in Jamaica. So we are here to give you that kind of support, but we all have to be compliant with the local and international laws. Thank you.
So we'll hear now from our Vincentian colleagues as to how has been the experience since the passage of your law in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. In St. Vincent, the experience for us, just like Jamaica, has been twofold. It's been good, and it has also been bad. The Medicinal Cannabis Authority in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a statutory body, and it's made up of an inspectorate department where the majority of our inspectors came from agricultural backgrounds. So our job basically is to monitor all of the traditional cultivators. And when I say traditional cultivators, I mean those persons who would have been in cannabis before. Because when we created our act in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, it was shaped around our traditional cultivators. So we kept them in mind when our act was done. So we have a licensing department, we have an inspectorate department, and a technical department. And for us in St. Vincent, so far we would have licensed 161 persons. They consist of not just traditional cultivators, but also foreign investor companies, as well as local investors and local cultivators. And local cultivators for us are those persons who want to get into the industry, but has never done it before. So the experience for us, it's been, as I said, good, because our cultivators now who have license can now come down from where they've been planting, which most of them would have been planting in the hills, so they can now come closer down and they can do their cultivation without being interfered or without the interference of the police department. For us in St. Vincent, everything that has to do with cannabis in St. Vincent has to pass through the authority. It's a statutory body, and before the police can go in and even destroy a field of cannabis now, they have to come to the authority. They have to find out from us whether or not those persons are licensed, and if they are per se being protected. So everything that the cultivators do, we monitor. Everything that our foreign investors do, we monitor them from harvesting straight to processing. We've granted license, just like Jamaica, for research. We've granted license for processing. We've granted license for transporting. So it's been good. And then on the other side, it has been challenging because, as Ms. Blake would have mentioned, some of our stakeholders are not fully on board. So we have had those challenges where sometimes we are trying to get certain things done. And because of the astigmatism of the whole cannabis, sometimes persons have their own personal perceptions. So sometimes things does not get done as fast as we would want it to. Things are usually slowed down, and that causes problems, especially when it involves our foreign investors who would have invested a lot. And instead of things moving forward for them, it's been slowed down, it's been on hold. So that's one of the major challenges we have. But for us, the experience most of the time has been good, especially within the past year. When we would have had our first Cannabis Festival, we have seen an increase in applications because there have been more education. Persons have been hearing more about what is it that the Cannabis Authority is doing, what is it that medicinal cannabis is there for. So we have seen an increase in our applications. So I would say for the majority of the time, the experience for us has been a good one.
So we were joined online by CEO of the Cannabis Authority of Antigua and Barbuda. So Mr. Burton, we'd like to get your perspective as to how has been the experience in Antigua and Barbuda since the passing of your legislation.
Hi, good evening. I'm just having a slight technical difficulty. Can I take a second question on the second round, please?
Sure, no problem at all. So one more question to our Jamaican colleagues. I noticed that you've been legalized for 10 years now. And one of the questions that has surfaced a lot here in St. Lucia during our consultations with persons is that persons are expecting to see an increase in criminal activity or negative impacts as a result of the legalization. From your 10 years of experience, has that been the case as it relates to what has happened in Jamaica? Has the legalization of cannabis increased the use of cannabis by minors? Has it caused an increase in criminal activity or other negative impacts? Or is it that the cannabis industry has simply enhanced the economic activity in Jamaica and removed persons from an illegal space and caused a positive impact on the society?
Thank you for that. So first, it hasn't been legalized, it's decriminalized. So in the past where someone could have been arrested and charged for carrying a blunt or carrying, a small quantity, that doesn't happen anymore. And so what that has done is that it has opened up the freedom to use, because within the legislation, as an individual, you can have 5 plants at home. You can have your cannabis on your person for your medicinal use. And so those areas within which you could have been arrested, or that criteria on which you could have been arrested, you don't have that anymore. And because you have this now commercial space wherein anyone who wants to be a part of the industry just has to become licensed. Licensed, you don't have to grow, you can have a retail space where you buy from somebody who grows and you are able to sell it within that space. So because we have this closed loop space within which you can buy and sell, and you don't have to be hiding from the law anymore because of the decriminalization. I'm not going to say that there are not illicit activities taking place. Of course there is. But with the decriminalization, it limits the amount of that kind of activity because you don't have to do it anymore. You can just bring your business into a licit space. I wouldn't have the numbers for you, but I can safely say that the emerging industry of medicinal cannabis in Jamaica offers the freedom for people to be able to trade within the closed loop, and that in and of itself would reduce the need for criminal activity.
Thank you. Now I move to the CEO of the RSA here in St. Lucia. And the question for you, sir, is that we understand that there has been the formation of the Cannabis Forum, which is a grouping of regulatory authorities across the region. How do you see this grouping benefiting the industry here in the region?
Thanks for that question. Last year, March, incidentally, at the last Cannabis Symposium that was hosted in St. Lucia, we signed an MOU to create the Caribbean Cannabis Forum. It was a bold step, taking into consideration that at the time, St. Lucia didn't even have an authority, and we were asking the 4 other authorities in the region to sign on to an MOU with the Ministry of Commerce to allow for discourse on matters of cannabis in the region. 3 jurisdictions signed on last year, March, and to date we now have 5 jurisdictions as part of the forum. We had a meeting as recently as yesterday morning, and we have, throughout our monthly meetings, continued to examine some of the challenges that we have as a region. The lack of recognition internationally for the region, and conceptualize means and manners of addressing these issues. So we are, as I see it, looking to ensure that there's an umbrella representative entity that can speak on behalf of the region's authorities can speak to international bodies, to donors, to your local investors, to allow them to understand that we are distinct from Latin America, from Europe, and we have our own interests, we have our own peculiar issues, and we would like to have our own voice in the cannabis space. There is, to our mind, given that we are so many within this space, there's quite a loud voice if we are allowed to speak. So we believe that the forum gives us that opportunity. And as the time goes by in the coming years, we believe that the Caribbean, which is known for cannabis use, will get an opportunity to sit at the table throughout the world at the various opportunities given.
So my next question is for Ms. Jacobs. Cannabis has been seen for many years as a dangerous drug. How do you see the legalization of cannabis being accepted by the wider society? And how was it that in St. Vincent you were able to get persons to embrace cannabis as an industry that should be legalized?
I would say, in terms of us in St. Vincent, well, for cannabis being a dangerous drug, and how do you see the legalization of it being accepted by the wider society? The perception of cannabis and its legalization has evolved significantly over the years. It has been viewed as a dangerous substance and was often linked to mental health issues, criminality, and social decline. Over the years, research have shown that it has medicinal benefits. And for that, there are several key factors that are now influencing the shift of seeing cannabis from being a dangerous drug to being something that is now accepted by society, one of which is the medical benefits of cannabis, and also the economic benefits, because it is now bringing in revenue, and it's also creating jobs for persons in St. Vincent and the wider Caribbean. What was the second part of the question?
The second part was, what were some of the strategies used to get persons to embrace the industry during your time of getting it decriminalized?
One of the things we did is that we would have held several consultations. Even before the act was passed, we would have held several consultations with the public, trying to bring the information to them and letting them know this is what we want to do. We would have had consultations with the Christian community. So when the act was being developed, we've had conversations with the Christian community. Every stakeholder possible that would have been influential were all consulted. And one of the major strategies we've used over the years has been, again, the Cannabis Festival. That in itself has brought so many persons, so much attention to cannabis, and has brought so many information to persons that would have cleared up a lot of misinformation, because we have seen it on the news a lot of times, right in St. Vincent. We have heard persons talk about cannabis and what their perception of cannabis, what they think that cannabis is doing. And I think the Cannabis Festival was one of our major strategies of actually bringing the information to persons. Having our conferences, persons were able to go into those conferences and get information, educational information on cannabis, not just for St. Vincent, but also for the wider Caribbean. Persons in St. Vincent were able to, I would say, have an open mind. They are now more accepting to cannabis in St. Vincent and what the other major medical benefits of cannabis, because we have seen it now with our applications as well as our patient access, because persons would come to us to get a medicinal card. Whenever they go to the doctor, they come to us for a card to show that they are legal to be able to consume cannabis. And we have seen an increase in that over the past year since our Cannabis Festival. So one of our major strategies would have been the Cannabis Festival.
Thank you. And now we want to bring in once again our colleague online from Antigua, And the question that we have for you is that many persons, when they hear of cannabis, the first thought goes to smoking. And we would like you to tell our audience, what else could be done with the cannabis plant? Because one of the things that we've recognized is that there's this myth that the only thing that cannabis is used for, can be used for, is to smoke. And though it is one of the applications of the plant, could you share with our audience what other uses that this plant has and how it could benefit persons within the society?
Good evening, everyone. Before I answer, I do want to say a special congratulations to the RSA and the team here in Lucia for getting this far in their cannabis journey and their substance management journey. The hats off to Dylan and his team for this opportunity. Special congrats to having Jamaica and St. Vincent and Grenadines being there. You asked the question, what are the uses for cannabis? We commonly think of it from a smoking point of view. When you look at where has that come from, that's a historical and a cultural influence into our society. Because within our Caribbean islands, we all have that level of Rastafari influence into our culture. And their history and tradition would have brought cannabis to the forefront from a smokable point of view. But where we are in 2025 is that we know cannabis can be used for medicine. So all cannabis is not illegal cannabis. We know cannabis can be used for recreational adult use. We know cannabis can be used for industrial uses. When you look at the medicinal side, which is our realm, you then look at the method of consumption for cannabis. So cannabis can be consumed whether by oil, by a topical, by drops. If you're in the industrial world, you're looking at what can I make with the cannabis plant. And we see it in the hemp world, you're seeing from paper to ropes, to hoses, to hempcrete, a replacement to blocks. So you're seeing this plant becoming a very, not only diverse plant, but is multi-purpose. And within this space, what's always recommended is that you find your purpose to why you're growing cannabis, to why you're trying to bring it to the market, to who are your end customers. So if you're going to be making a cannabis shampoo, then you want to ensure that you're growing the specific cannabis, the specific strain, to help you yield the results that you're looking for. That is a stigma we all are working towards changing, that when you think about cannabis, that you don't immediately think about it from a smokable consumption method. One of the popular methods you see in growing right now is in the beverage industry. Lots of cannabis beverages are coming about. And then also a lot of creams and rubs are coming to the forefront. So that's, you can dive into as deep as possible to possible methods of consumption, to the uses. But I think for us, it's how do we apply the medicinal side to the industry. Vaping is also a unique aspect that we're seeing. We do have some chemo patients who are being recommended by the doctor to consume cannabis via vaping so that you can help manage their nausea and also to open their appetite. So it comes down to the purpose and then finding the help from the plant to address your purpose.
Thank you. Thank you. Having identified so many uses of cannabis, one of the things that persons have not recognized is that last year in 2024, it is estimated that the cannabis industry worldwide generated $41.95 billion in revenue. And by 2033, it is expected to grow to $121.33 billion generated. So, Mr. Inglis, how do you see the region getting to participate in this activity so that we could be part of this billion-dollar industry?
Cannabis internationally is seen as ours, and we have failed culturally to capitalize on a product that has been recognized as ours. So whereas the plant may not have originated in the Caribbean, when you think about ganja or marijuana use, people think about the Rastafarian community. They think about Bob Marley. They think about our culture, a culture that is unique to us. People that have used the plant, albeit illegally, for many, many years, and become the face and the poster child for cannabis. So I do not believe that we receive anywhere near our fair share of the multi-billion-dollar industry that you spoke of, given that it is an industry that we are recognized for. Statistics have shown that the average cannabis-consuming tourist spends about 31% more than a non-cannabis consuming tourist. We saw, subject to correction, about 1 million people come to St. Lucia last year. So doing the math, you can see that there is clearly scope for quite a few persons who are coming into the country, and just if these persons are cannabis users, a bump of about 30% of the amount spent on island. That is not to say that every single tourist would be using cannabis, but that is to say that if you have marketed yourself consistent with what persons already recognize you as being, because they recognize the region as being a place of cannabis. So your individuals who suffer from PTSD, who suffer from a number of the ailments that cannabis use can assist with, these persons are coming to a space in the Caribbean where they believe that they can access that plant because they've heard about it, they've seen it, they know that it exists in the area. They can come to these areas in St. Lucia, Jamaica, St. Vincent, Antigua, and they can obtain therapeutic cannabis and go through their treatment for their PTSD, for their anxiety, for whatever ailment that befalls them in this space that is known for cannabis use. So to my mind, we have really failed to capture our brand. We have really fallen behind the 8 ball with the other jurisdictions like Canada that have capitalized on cannabis internationally. And whereas we have other jurisdictions that have gotten the model right in terms of mass production, they still cannot capitalize on the Caribbean brand of cannabis. And you will still find that the persons who want to benefit from the therapeutic use of cannabis, not getting high for the sake of getting high, but want to benefit from therapeutic use of cannabis, still think to the Caribbean way of cannabis, the organic way of cannabis. The thinking of cannabis is ours. So as we seek to grow our industries from as far down as Guyana to as high up as Jamaica, the hope is that we're not only saying to these persons, you can come into our jurisdiction and use a cannabis cream, but that when you are using the cannabis cream that we have, you are using it with the mindset, the ethos of the individuals who would have used it for millennia. So what we have done in the Caribbean for the Rastafari community is inclusive of what the Indians did with cannabis from thousands of years ago, what the Chinese did with cannabis from thousands of years ago, because they brought it here. And we have grown from that cannabis knowledge and grown that cannabis knowledge. So I believe that the figures that you quoted are conservative, because we have the opportunity to do even better and higher than that.
Excellent. So I'm guessing from what you have said there that we can look forward to maybe some Blue Mountain strains or Blue Mountain cannabis, the Peter cannabis. Maybe in St. Vincent with all those black sand beaches, we're going to have sulfur cannabis and things of that sort that are going to be the Caribbean brands that you could only get within the region. So the question now, and I'll start with Mr. Bolton, who's online. A lot of persons are asking, why medicinal cannabis over recreational cannabis as is done in some regions? So persons are wanting to know, is it that it's simply a cover-up for recreational cannabis by calling it medicinal cannabis? So really, why is it that our region has decided to go down the route of medicinal cannabis over recreational cannabis?
Hey team, so I did have a little trouble hearing the question, but I heard the latter part about medicinal cannabis in respect to recreational cannabis.
That is correct.
Could you just repeat the latter part of the question?
So the question is that why did the region But all of our jurisdictions have decided to go down that route of going the route of medicinal cannabis over recreational cannabis.
Yeah. So he asked the question just for clarity because I heard the first part was a bit muffled. Why did we choose to go down medicinal cannabis route instead of recreational?
Correct.
Correct? That's the question? Okay. So remember, I can speak for Antigua and Barbuda only. And the decision was made even before I was there. But when you see what led to our decision as a country, it was in some political spaces, you would say the more safest route to do it. In regards to the international conventions and those international laws that still binds and keeps us together. Medicinal aspects of cannabis is what's technically allowed. Research for cannabis and also the sacramental use of it. For me, I personally don't want to see an adult use community unless the education heavily supersedes it. So I welcome the fact that we all went the route of medicinal, where we now have the opportunity to actually prove some things. There's a great opportunity and space for the proof to show on actual Caribbean people. When you look at even some of these medicinal studies and research, they're not done with our demographic. So I'm glad that we now have the opportunity to bring something to this international table. I also like the fact that we're not following the, what quote unquote, the first world, the Canada, the United States, the Europe. Like Dylan said, we can bring something new, something Caribbean, something cultural to this arena. So for us here, the medicinal route is what we really want to get done and done proper or as close to perfect, with the inclusion of the evidence, with the inclusion of the education. And then once we have an educated society, then I think it's prudent that we can move forward to that more recreational adult use. And we've seen it in some of the Rasta communities. When you have a different understanding for cannabis, you don't misuse it and abuse it. So that's what we think for Antigua and Barbuda we need in our society, an educated society that properly uses this substance.
So Mr. I'll say that I would like to hear from Ms. Black, Ms. Blake, sorry. Why did Jamaica choose the route to go down medicinal cannabis over recreational?
So I will just add a little to what Regis has said. If we look at it from the perspective of our legislation, it's very cautious. In, I believe it was about 2016, thereabout, our Minister of Foreign Affairs addressed the UN about cannabis, Minister Kamina Johnson-Smith. And in her presentation, she presented cannabis not as a drug, not as a Schedule I drug, as is depicted in the Single Convention. It is medicine. It is natural medicine. It is like mint tea. It is like any other herb any other natural herb that you would use at home for different things, you know. And as such, like Regis, it would have been before my time. But understanding through how the legislation was created, how the regulations are placed, and some of the things that we are changing now to change with the time, you can just imagine that it really was from a place of caution, from international obligation, but also I support the route of medicinal because it lends credence and it gives respect to the herb as a medicine and not as a drug as it is portrayed in other spaces.
So we're there from St. Lucia now.
Lamentably, I cannot see it. It happened before my time. Make no mistake, the fight for the decriminalization and legalization of cannabis has been a battle. And within the war cries and war spaces, there's often a term used, start low and move slow. That's how you get through the battle. You start low, keep advancing, keep moving slowly. We think starting low and moving slow in the cannabis space means starting medicinally. This is not to say that as we understand cannabis use, as we are educated within cannabis use, that there may not be scope to lax the regulations and the legislation with regard to cannabis. But that is to say that at this juncture, we think it would be irresponsible, looking at the current trajectory of things with alcohol and other substances, to allow for a free-for-all of cannabis use. We think it would be more prudent to allow for a medicinal regime where there is the opportunity for education, for sensitization, for persons who need the product medicinally to begin to utilize it, for the uninitiated to have an understanding as to why cannabis is to be used, what it can be used for, what the various cannabinoids can do to you. In the space of cannabis-induced psychosis, which does exist, you have persons who have the opportunity to understand, okay, this isn't just for me to have fun with. I need to have reverence and respect for the plant. And as Regis would have said, in the Rastafarian community, I remember going to St. Mary's College with a Rastafarian and children teasing that, you probably get to smoke. And he said, no, I don't. Because there was an appreciation within his household, the Rastafarian household, that it was a sacrament, and you respect the plant, and you treat the plant in a certain way. So he was in shock that we were talking about weed in that way, because for him there was a high level of reverence for the plant. And we think if you are able to allow the population to see the plant as a medicine, to see the plant has these applications, that you can utilize it in this way, and you can trust the plant can work these number of milligrams in this application will have this effect on me. And it's not a situation where you're taking a brownie and you don't know how much THC is in it and you're complaining tomorrow that, okay, I had a trip. No. You took 2 milligrams of THC, 4 milligrams of CBN, etc., because you had this that you wanted to have as an effect. And after you've gone through that for some time, you've started low, as I said, you then have the ability to move slowly and determine that do you want to relax things a little bit? Do you want to allow persons to possibly utilize it in this manner, in this way? We think that is the safest to approach cannabis use in St. Lucia, and I think that has been the similar thinking throughout the region, and that's why we've adopted that stance.
Now we hear from Mr. Vincent Mimigramini, Ms. Jacob.
Just like all of our other Caribbean brothers and sisters, well, I have to say brothers and sisters because I just learned recently that persons have gender for the Caribbean islands. So, just like our Caribbean brothers and sisters, we also in St. Vincent have international obligations. So, for us, several of the reasons why we chose to go recreational. One, as I mentioned earlier, before our act was passed, and we would have had several consultations, we would have done a survey. And what our survey found for the persons in St. Vincent is that majority of the Vincentian population preferred medicinal cannabis over recreational. And 2, our banking system, which was one of our challenges in St. Vincent when we started the cannabis industry. The banking system was very difficult for us to be able to accomplish. And the banks does not permit our cultivators to bank recreational, anything that comes from recreational. Our banks does not permit that. So that was another reason why we chose to go recreational. Also, medicinal. Also, our law was shaped around several of our stakeholders, one of which was our Christian community. They had a say in shaping our act in St. Vincent. So going recreational was not going to be something that they would have preferred. So those were the main reasons why we in St. Vincent decided that we would do medicinal over recreational.
Thank you. We now open up for questions from the audience to our panel. So anyone who has any questions that you would like to ask our panel, both online or in our audience, just raise your hand and we have a floating mic where we could go ahead, sir.
Yeah, good evening all. Thank you for being here. It's not question per se. It's simply the myth about cannabis and the direction it has to go, according to what I'm hearing here. Because I've not heard nothing about cannabis and sustainability. You know, because there is this document, Cannabis and Sustainable Development. And I know that we are aware that we need to attain the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, and in 2025, we are way behind time. Now, the reason why the globe is going to legalize cannabis by 2030 is simply to attain the development goals. Reason for that is cannabis is one of the biodiversity that is featured in every single development goal. We have 17 development goals. We're looking at cannabis when it comes to ending poverty. That is the goal number 1. Then we have goal number 2 for sustainable development. We're looking at ending hunger and achieving food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. That's goal number 2. We're looking at goal number 3, ensuring healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Number 4 is ensure inclusive and equitable equality, education, and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. We look at number 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. We look at 6, ensure access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy for all. We look at number 8, decent works and economic growth. We look at 9, build resilience, inclusive and sustainable infrastructure, industry, and innovation. 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. We look at 12, responsible consumption and production. 13, combat climate change and its impacts. 15, ecosystems and life on land. 16, peace, justice, human rights, rule of law, and strong institutions. And we look at final 17, partnership for goals. You see, we're missing out because this is the relevant subject when it comes to dealing with the cannabis plant, which is so sacred to human nature. And I agree to we going into medicinal because persons are asking why medicinal? Because it's a medicinal plant. So we have to go medicinal and not recreational, but personal use. We are fighting a cause. We're going to win it, but we have to do it together. You see, I appreciate the region coming together because we need to harmonize. We can't do it like America, where each state where you go to, the laws are different. No. We need to come together as the Caribbean and harmonize and make sure that it's a level playing field across the region. We've now set up the Caribbean Cannabis Fair Trade Working Group. It was set up in 2021 in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in 2019, sorry, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It has grown tremendously. We have mostly all the islands on board, including Latin America, which is Mexico and Colombia. At the St. Vincent Cannabis Festival, we were present. And we also been funded by TNI. And what happened there in St. Vincent is we launched the Caribbean Cannabis Fair Trade Working Group in St. Vincent. The mission and the logo, and also the vision. Because we need to make sure that we cater for the traditional farmers. It's all about reparatory justice. Persons have been marginalized in St. Lucia and all around the Caribbean. How do we deal with that and treat them with justice for one and for all? I can go for the whole day, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, panel and our international guests, or regional guests. The fight for us personally started many years ago. Before Jamaica, we submitted a proposal in 1998. The whole energy behind the reformation of the laws was coming from a social justice standpoint. Back in 1998, 1990, 2000, there was no talk of medical cannabis, medicinal cannabis. That wasn't a term that we were hearing. And the only time we heard that term was when California went legal, and they talked about medicinal cannabis. So I know that we're trying to appease the INCB, but what I understand, because of Rastafari, because of reggae music, because of ganja consumption, as we know, it's regional. Bob Marley, Peter Tosh legalized it. That's 50 years ago. We are known, as Dylan rightfully said, as a region known for cannabis. St. Lucia, I could speak for St. Lucia as opposed, I know when we were comparing St. Vincent with St. Lucia, we were saying that St. Vincent is a producer island and St. Lucia is a consumer island. And I could testify that many people in St. Lucia use it. How do we determine if it's being used, if it's medicinal as opposed to recreational? Because we drink recreationally, regionally. We have carnival, we have bacchanal, we have soca, and this is part of our culture. But reggae, Rastafari, and ganja is also part of our culture. And I feel that the INCB is not respecting our cultural right to use cannabis any way we want. And now we are being bounded by these international regulations that we signed on to, the 2 international drug laws. And obviously I'm speaking not from a Rastafari point of view, but there are many other people who are non-Rastafari who enjoy using cannabis whichever way they want. And there are many of our farmers here who also, some of our top growers, have nothing to do with Rastafari. So, and our Ministry of Tourism is looking at ganja tourism. And it can have a medicinal aspect. My question is, why can't we do it the way that Uruguay and Canada did it and go full 100? Yes, we have the medicinal, but we go full 100 with the recreational and personal use. Are we going to be sanctioned because of who we are, and Uruguay and Canada could go ahead with it and we can't?
So thanks for that question. And persons often draw the parallels between larger states like Uruguay and Canada. You would be surprised to note that in the conversations that we would have had, not necessarily with the INCB, but with our corresponding banks, we had greater challenges. So as would have been referenced in the case of St. Vincent, federally, within the US, cannabis is still prohibited. Specific states have caused for the legal use, but federally, it is still prohibited. So your access to corresponding banks within the US framework is not permitted. So if it is that we have funding, and we recognize that cannabis is a cash crop, So you have quite a bit of money both leaving the jurisdiction and coming into the jurisdiction, whether it be to invest in your industry or to pay to individuals who have invested in the industry from overseas. In our initial discussions, we were unable to get any corresponding bank in the US to allow for cannabis funds to go through. And this is not a conversation with the INCB. This is a conversation that we're having with local banks and international banks that are saying, if your local banks have funds in them that are part of a quote-unquote recreational industry, we will not allow their funds to come to the US. So
SWIFT system.
that is within the SWIFT system. You would be surprised then to see that if you were to go to Europe and say, well, maybe we don't use American banks for corresponding for cannabis. Let's look at Europe. You'd be surprised to find that Europe, where you have countries that have allowed for that use, would similarly say, if you're doing recreational, your money can't come through here. You could then go to Canada and say, I would like to legalize. You have a recreational industry in your jurisdiction. Can we allow for funds to go through Canada for recreational use in St. Lucia? They would be surprised to find that they would say to you, if it's recreational, no. So again, persons on the Bexor bus or the Viewfort bus may be saying, let's just do it like Canada did with their own international banks who don't need to have that corresponding banking working in their favor because they have international banks. We had Canadian banks here, Royal Bank of Canada, CIBC, these are Canadian banks. TD, BMO, these are Canadian banks. So there's a lot less pressure internationally when I have my banks in the US and I have my banks in Europe. When you only have First National Bank and Bank of St. Lucia and some of these banks who are saying to you, if you want to still go on Amazon and swipe that Visa card to purchase something on Amazon, you are going to go by my rules. Or you won't be allowed to have money come through my system. So it's not that it is impossible for us to say we're going full 100. But it is that we're saying if we do that, recognize that the implications are not just for the cannabis users in St. Lucia. It's for all of the persons in St. Lucia who may not be willing not to be able to use their bank card tomorrow. And I'm sure you've seen jurisdictions, not for cannabis reasons, but for other reasons, who have had the visa system not work in their country and seen the uproar. We currently have countries in our jurisdiction, in our region, who have challenges with using correspondent banking for the US. And we've seen the outcry because all of a sudden they can't purchase anything on Amazon. Just a simple example. So we say to persons, it is not that we are lacking the bravery for us to look at a broader mechanism. It is that we recognize, as I said earlier, it is a battle. And in a battle, you start low and you move slow.
Thank you very much for that, Dylan. Any other questions?
Yes, good evening. Aaron Alexander, President of the Ionola Council for the Advancement of Rastafari and Pan-African People. Seemed to me that the path of least resistance is what's being adopted. So that is good. It is really heartening to see this symposium this evening because as has been indicated by some of the persons at the head table, the Rastafari community has really been at the forefront and as the vanguards for quote-unquote legalizing ganja for many years. And for decades, as a matter of fact. And we see the progression. We see what is happening now where, you know, taking people from an illegal standpoint and bring them into a legal framework because the whole Rastafari community was criminalized basically for their association with cannabis, with ganja. And as Dylan would have indicated earlier, we supported ganja when the idea was not popular at all. We stood by ganja when we were being prosecuted and persecuted. We stood by ganja, you know, through rain and storm. And we are very thankful today that, should I say, quote unquote, ordinary people are seeing the light of supporting ganja, supporting cannabis, albeit on medicinal levels, you know. That is also welcome because within the Rastafari community, ganja, cannabis is held in such high regards that medicinal is definitely a part of that realm that we respect ganja in that realm of being a medicine. And when I heard earlier Brother Dylan mention at the college where this young man was being teased and the classmates or schoolmates thought that he was smoking, engaging in smoking, and he's like, no, he doesn't smoke. And they were baffled, they were surprised, because it is naturally assumed that in Rastafari households, the parents allow the children to indulge, and it's not so. It is not so, and society needs to understand that. The high regards the Rastafari community holds towards cannabis, that we don't just free for all in a household for our children. It has to be done responsibly, and it has to be used, when you're of a certain age, that you could make that decision on your own. You'll get the teachings of black history, you'll get the teachings of the ancestry, you'll get those teachings of consciousness, minus the ganja in the household. And as a good sister indicated earlier, ganja could be seen as a mint. So yes, a child would drink a tea or so, and you make a tea for a child, that's not a problem. But to actually partake in smoking, it's a no-no. So in the whole thrust towards bringing this industry to light, I hope and I pray that the Rastafari community will be used to be part of the educational side of teaching our people responsible use and teaching our people about ganja etiquette and teaching our people about respecting the herb, because the Rastafari is also high on that, no pun intended, right? Rastafari is always also high on educating our people about cannabis and respecting the herb, because it's of no use and service to us that children carrying cannabis in school. It makes it that much harder for us to get it legalized. It makes it that much harder, so it's of no benefit to us. So we need to get into the school system and tell the children cannabis does not belong in schools. And we have embarked on that journey currently. The council, Rastafari Council, through our education committee, we are now going into the secondary school. We actually start doing your work already, Dylan. You know that. Although we're not being paid for it, but we're doing the work. So we are going into the schools already and speaking to the children about those issues and the need to respect cannabis. And cannabis don't belong in school. And they make it that much harder for those of us who are fighting for the legalization, they make it that much harder when they engage in those practices. So I give thanks for this forum this evening. And it's very heartening, as I say, to see that truly, like Bob Marley said, the herb is for the healing of the nations. So probably the nations are being healed right now. Give thanks, prophecy is being fulfilled. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So I would like to thank our panel, Ms. Simone Jacobs, Senior Inspector of the Medical Cannabis Authority out of St. Vincent, Ms. Farah Blake, CEO of the Cannabis License Authority of Jamaica, and Mr. Regis Burton, CEO of the Cannabis Authority of Antigua and Barbuda, for participating with us, and we're very happy to have you here. We will now be moving into our second segment, where we will be discussing issues relating to the Cannabis Bill of St. Lucia, and we'll be taking some questions. So we'll now have an exchange of the head table, where Ms. Blake and Ms. Jacobs will be leaving us, and the Deputy Chair of the RSA board will be joining us at the head table so that he can field some questions. He's known as the cannabis man in some places, so Mr. Vernie Manuel will be joining us now at the head table. So as many of you know, we have been going through the length and breadth of St. Lucia, looking at the cannabis bill. And we've had many consultations and got many comments from many persons across St. Lucia. And today what we want to do is to do a validation of some of those comments that we've had here at this particular forum. And I want to start with our Deputy Chair. I think I'm going to start him off. Hopefully it's not a googly, and that he could be able to answer it well. It's a question that we have from our online audience, and the question is, what measures are in the bill to ensure public safety and prevent underage access to cannabis?
All right, good evening, everyone. The bill contemplates that cannabis will be available in two forms. Class 1, which would be able to dispense by persons who are over 21, and Class 2, which would be able to be dispensed by persons who are under medical supervision. This distinction will be made in terms of what qualifies as Class 1 or Class 2 will be made by the Medical Advisory Council. So that's threshold. But persons who are under the age of 21 will not be able to access medicinal cannabis. Whereas persons who are under 21 or of any age under medical supervision would be able to access Class 2 cannabis. And that is the primary provision for public safety. So a child would not be able to access cannabis without medical supervision.
So as we're on that, we're going to pass on to the CEO to just give us a deeper explanation as to what is the Class 1 and the Class 2, because this is one of the questions that has come up repeatedly. Class 1, Class 2, what is it? Is it a different type of marijuana, of cannabis? Is it, what really is Class 1 and Class 2?
Thanks for that, Kurt. So before we sought out to develop a framework for cannabis use in St. Lucia, we looked to see what existed in the legislation of the various jurisdictions and what happened practically in these jurisdictions, because we didn't think it prudent to develop a piece of legislation that did not work practically. We recognized that there were a number of cannabis substances which the medicinal fraternity did not think would necessarily require a prescription. And in the case of some of these jurisdictions, they either were compelling individuals to get a prescription for these low threshold cannabis products, or they were giving permission for individuals so to do, which was against the legislation. We didn't think it proper to adopt either of these stances. So within our framework, we sought to adopt a two-pronged approach to cannabis use. That if an individual reaches an age of 21, and again, we had lengthy discussions with the Rastafarian community, with the medical community to determine what would have been the ideal age. We looked at as high as 25 and looked at as low as 16 and settled on the age of 21, saying that if somebody is 21, they would be able to, without a prescription or without having a conversation with a medicinal practitioner, access Class 1 medicinal cannabis. If it is that they wanted to access Class 2 medicinal cannabis, which is a more potent variety, they would require a prescription from a medical doctor. If they were under the age of 21, they would require the prescription for either Class 1 or Class 2. But we didn't want to determine what that potency would have been. And we also didn't want to place a potency within the legislation to crystallize it and require an act of parliament to change it. So we thought it would be wise to create a medicinal cannabis advisory council within the legislation. Now that council advises on a myriad of issues, but it also advises on cannabis use specifically and what would be Class 1 and Class 2. So that council can advise the minister that with the expertise of the persons who are on the council, which includes the CMO, which includes representative of the Rastafarian community, the Medical and Dental Association, the Pharmacy Association, these individuals would sit there with the expertise that they have and determine the threshold for, if it is flour, for example, what would be the percentage in the flour that they would want to allow for Class 1 versus Class 2. If it was to be your tincture, it is to be consumed by individuals, what would be the threshold? If it is an edible, for example, what is the maximum number of milligrams of THC or CBN, CBG that they want to allow for somebody to access at the age of 21 without a prescription? And if it is that they make that recommendation to the minister, then that would then be placed in an order which would dictate the level of access for individuals on island. So it is something different. It does not exist in any of the other jurisdictions. But we thought for the elderly lady who wants to get a CBD cream for her knees would not require a prescription from a medicinal practitioner to go every month to a Class 1 dispensary to get that cream for her knees. If it is that somebody is a cancer patient and requires a very strong potency THC product, then that person can go to their medicinal practitioner and get that prescribed and access it. So it allows for individuals from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, with different use cases for cannabis to access cannabis.
Thank you, Dylan. To Mr. Emmanuel, persons are still a little bit not sure on how the amnesty is expected to work, why an amnesty is being given at all, and what was the thought process behind offering an amnesty at all?
All right, so in the aspect of the amnesty came about that we realized that in starting off this industry, we have traditional cultivators who need to be brought into a legal framework. Anyone who is cultivating 4 plants or more is outside of the existing legal framework. The existing legal framework also did not allow for any use of cannabis. So the amnesty essentially will allow persons who are current cultivators, traditional cultivators, to have an amnesty where they can regularize their production. We also note that there is some significant production in protected areas, and we need to get that production out of those protected areas, forest reserves, water reserves, and so that these persons have an avenue and a mechanism to, one, be recognized as a traditional cultivator, and two, regularize their existing situation into the legal framework. The traditional, with the amnesty, someone can be recognized as a traditional cultivator. And we also wanted persons who did not have specific criminal records for cannabis cultivation to be able to access and be recognized as a traditional cultivator. So we didn't want it only that if you had a criminal record for cannabis, would have been the only mechanism for you to be recognized. With the amnesty, persons will be able to be recognized as a traditional cultivator and also be able to obtain a traditional cultivator's license. Now, the traditional cultivator's license most likely will give them priority access to being part of the central trading entity. Other persons who are not involved in cannabis in any way, shape, or form and are not traditional cultivators can apply for a normal cultivator's license. And so the traditional cultivator's license, the access route to that is through the amnesty.
So, Dylan, another issue that we see coming up is that persons are not sure what the CTE is all about, or the Central Trading Entity. Persons would like clarity as to why Tenusha chose to go down the route of a CTE and how it is expected that the CTE is to operate.
Thank you for that question. I think I've answered it about 6 or 7 times in the last few weeks. But it really is important. So the CTE is something that we also did not see in the other jurisdictions that had the legislation with regard to cannabis. When we were going through the framework and parameters for cannabis use, we recognized that there was major concern by the traditional operators in this space that if you legalize, the investors would come in and monopolize the industry and push them out of a space that they had been in for so many years. In some of the jurisdictions, like in St. Vincent, we saw a major thrust to ensure that these traditional cultivators remain part of the space. But we thought it prudent to include an additional step of protection for these individuals. So what the central trading entity seeks to do is it compels an entity to sit at the center of the entire regime. That entity, in the current draft of the legislation, and we're still subject to review of the parameters for the CTE, but that CTE, as it is drafted now, must be owned, at least 20% of it must be owned by traditional cultivators, which would have been individuals who have received that amnesty. So persons who have said, I was cultivating cannabis, I can evidence that I was cultivating cannabis. I was one of the individuals who who had been ostracized by society, who may have had a conviction, who could not benefit from the usual other benefits of society because of my cannabis use or cultivation, and I would like to be recognized in that way. And I want to be treated as an individual who had been maligned because of my involvement in the cannabis industry. So the CTE must have a percentage of ownership from these individuals. As it stands now, the percentage in the draft bill is 20%. And as it stands now, no one traditional cultivator can own more than 2% of the CTE, meaning that you're compelling the CTE to have a number of traditional cultivators who have a stake in it. What happens based on the flow of cannabis in the legislation is that after cultivation, cannabis must be sold either to the central trading entity or must pay the central trading entity to bypass it, even in the event you're a cultivator and processor. You would like to keep your cannabis as opposed to selling it and buying it back. In a case like that, you would have to pay the CTE a set fee for bypassing the CTE and keeping your cannabis for you to process and sell. What that causes is a situation where an investor who comes into the country and invests $20 million in a large-scale farm, a processing plant, his export license to have his cannabis go overseas, or wants to have the cannabis stay on island for dispensing. Because of the CTE, every single bud propagated in St. Lucia, an amount would have to be paid to the central trading entity. So the persons who would have been part of the industry, your traditional cultivators, who now can be part of your CTE, even if they no longer involved in cannabis, even if they feel like it's too expensive for them to get into because of the cost of large-scale farming, even if they're now disenchanted and they don't have time for it, whatever the case is, we are ensuring that they have a slice of the pie from the industry as it grows, because they would have been members of the central trading entity, and the dividends paid to them would allow for them to reap the benefits of the industry in St. Lucia. So that is the thinking behind the central trading entity. Though the legislation speaks to it being a minimum of 20% traditional cultivators, we would love to see it be 100. But we recognize that the central trading entity must have considerable financial flexibility and float, because you would not want, as a farmer who was accustomed to selling your cannabis and receiving the remuneration in a short space of time, to give your cannabis to a central trading entity and wait 2 and 3 and 4 weeks to be paid. So that central trading entity would have to have the financial float to be able to pay out to that farmer even before they can sell to a dispensary or receive the money back from that dispensary. Recognizing that and having conversations with stakeholders like Invest St. Lucia, we noted that you want to allow an investor who may be coming in, or a non-cannabis player who may be wanting to invest in a central trading entity, the ability to have their ownership stake in that company as well. So that is why the minimum was set at 20%, so they would engage your traditional cultivators, and they still have leeway of up to 80% of the company that they can own.
Thank you. We have a question from online. Any one of you could choose to answer that one. Does someone need a license to grow cannabis at home? And can someone grow more than 4 plants with the new bill?
You don't need a license to grow cannabis at home, but you are limited to 4 plants at home. So anything more than 4 plants, you need a license.
The follow-up question to that is, would one need to register with the RSA if they are growing cannabis at home, even without the license, but to allow persons to know that you are growing cannabis at home?
As it currently states, once you're growing more than 4 plants, you need a license. So even if it's at home, if you wish to grow more than 4 plants, you would be required to have a license.
Just to add on to that, the intention is to look at a mechanism to allow individuals to give notice if they're cultivating those 4 plants. It is not within the current legislation. It is being discussed to either include in the legislation or by way of regulations. And the thinking behind that is, you have individuals who would have had the 4 plants, and the amount for possession being 30 grams, you have individuals who, if they harvest their 4 plants, would have much more than the 30 grams. So individuals who recognize that, as we have, would be well suited to give notice to the RSA that I have 4 plants. If it is that you have given the RSA notice that you have 4 plants, then you now have an entity similar to what had been discussed by my sister from St. Vincent. You now have the entity that can say, we know that he has a pound of cannabis. We know that he has 2 pounds of cannabis because he had given notice that he was cultivating plants 3 months ago. The average propagation time would have been that. It makes sense that he has that amount at home. So in the event that a police officer comes to your home and sees that you have 2 pounds of cannabis, which you can get easily from having 4 plants, you can then say, oh, no, I gave notice to the RSA that I had these 4 plants, and that is the amount that I would have harvested from my 4 plants, which it would be a legitimate amount to have had given that I was growing the 4 plants. So that is being conceptualized because we recognize the disjuncture between the 4 plants and the 30 grams that one is allowed to be in possession of. So that is one of the ways we're trying to deal with that.
So we now open up for questions from the audience.
Going back to the 4 plants, I remember at one of the consultations, an elderly gentleman asked, yes, I have 4 plants, but when I harvest, do I have to start from scratch? Simply meaning I have 4 plants, but I need starter. So in an event I know my plant is going to get ready in 1 month time, I need to start propagating to replace my 4 plants. We'd like to see some adjustment in the legislation concerning this because it's very critical for the people them still.
Thank you for that comment. It is something that we will take under advisement and give consideration to, but we want you to also recognize the challenge that you would have with opening that gate. Because if I then say, you have 4 plants, but we want to allow you 4 plants and these plants are 1 month old, and another 4 plants and these plants are 1 month old, and all of a sudden you're looking at propagating another set of 4 plants every 2 weeks because you want to make sure that you always have a flow. So again, recognize that you don't want to open that door because there would be now the ambit for abuse. So that is why the legislation is framed as it is framed.
Yes, I work at the Bureau of Standards. Mr. Manuel is my boss. Just some comments on the I sent some comments on the actual bill. I noticed in the bill you all make reference in a particular section to 60 grams, and in that same section you also talk about pounds. I was curious as to why do you use metric and imperial units within the law, or is there a particular cultural thing why the bigger units are measured in pounds and the smaller ones are in grams? But we would like to see, from my department's perspective, that you use a metric consistently.
So thanks for that comment. I'm sure Mr. Emmanuel will ensure that we, at board level during our next review, because again, the bill has gone through an iterative process. What you see now is not the first draft, it's not the second, it's not the third. We've been at this for quite some time, as far back as 2020, and even as recently as a review that took place by the RSA staff during the course of last week, we saw coming out of the stakeholder engagements calls for a number of amendments to the draft. So thanks for that, and we'll take that in the investment during our next review.
We have one question from online, which the question is, can someone give notice on behalf of someone else?
No, all the cultivators' licenses are personal. So you can only give notice on behalf of yourself, and you can only be over 21 to be a cultivator.
Thank you. So another question from the audience.
So I wanted to ask, in terms of the medicinal cannabis, for practitioners who are licensed, who are given the license, is there the license to practice, to prescribe? Will the license be a lifetime? Will it be for a certain period? Will it be tied into our practicing certificate? Is there criteria for relicensing? Has that been worked out? And also, if there will be some level of reporting forms given to those physicians who will be licensed, so that they can monitor the effect of the medication that they're prescribing on the patients. Okay. Since we are dealing with you could say a naive population that has, well, some of us have been exposed, but for the most part.
Okay, so again, thanks for that question, and it speaks to the importance of these sorts of forums. So the last iteration of the bill spoke to a need for medicinal practitioners to become licensed to prescribe. The current draft does not require licensing by medicinal practitioners. What it requires is a registration, but they would have had to have met the requirements of the Medical and Dental Council. So we are now accepting the Medical and Dental Council as the competent authority to determine if a practitioner should be able to prescribe cannabis. And in that case, that person only needs to register with the RSC. So it is not a vetting process, so to speak. It is recognizing that the authority responsible for making you a doctor would have had the competence to also determine that you can prescribe cannabis. So whereas the last version that many people would have read through spoke to the doctor had to meet this requirement and meet that requirement that the RSA would have imposed, and they would have had to have been licensed by the RSA as a doctor so to prescribe. The current draft speaks to the Medicinal Dental Council will make that determination. They will advise that this person we have vetted. We are the Medical and Dental Council. We have vetted this doctor. You just register him and allow him to be part of your seed to sale platform and allow him to prescribe. So that again is the benefit of having these kinds of conversations, because through these conversations we have now changed that metric and we only require the registration of the doctor.
I have one question. Going back to what we started off with in terms of the different classes, and I know the example was given in terms of the levels of either THC or cannabinoids in different products, right? What mechanism will be in place to actually go around measuring that? Because in terms of saying we need so many grams or whatever in a gummy or whatever it is, or in a brownie, who is going to be measuring that and how are we going to put that in place? Because what prevents me from saying that I'm doing grade 1 when I'm actually doing grade 2? Who is going to be measuring my product to know what's going to be in place to monitor that, especially knowing in our society that enforcement is something that is very lacking in a lot of areas. So what is going to be put in place for us to be monitoring that?
All right, so in the conformity assessment mechanism, cannabis will be like any other product. And as such, if you're selling cannabis, your product would have to have a label. That label would have to ensure that it does not contain any what we call material non-disclosure. So invariably, your product would have to be tested before it is sold in conformance with that label being approved in and of itself. So the current context of artisanal products, cannabis will not be sold as an artisanal product. It will be sold from licensed dispensaries. And those licensed dispensaries will have a quality management system which would go from seed to sale to guarantee the quality of that product. So the current notion that we have, or the current operating framework, where there are no regulations, people just make their own claims. These, in the new regime, you will have to have verified and substantiated claims. And the only real cannabinoid of interest in the context of regulation and control is THC.
Yeah, another serious concern, and that concern is when I hear about MDs, what the medical doctors are going to prescribe. But we have a culture, indigenous culture, a herbal culture. We have herbal medicinal practice culture. So we're saying we don't agree that only the MDs prescribe. No. We need to make space for the traditional farmers and for the traditional healers to also administer. We're not prescribing, but administering. Because before there were doctors, nurses, and hospitals, Mother Nature was the great healer. We've been doing it for ages, and we still continue doing it. And we have a lot of success in what we're doing presently in the herbal fraternity. We have elements that the doctors presently cannot have proper intervention, and we have intervention because of our cultural arts, our indigenous arts, when it comes to nature, the herbs, and wellness. If you would like to see holistically within the region, we take that into consideration. Because we're talking about MDs, yes, they went to school, they're certified. The same we need for the herbal practitioners. Because presently we have Dr. Belle Antoine, professor at University of the West Indies. She led the way when it came to the cannabis reform in the region. We need to look at that documentation again. And we need to work with her and the universities in the region to help empower our traditional medicinal herbalists, you know. We need to do that. Because there are instances if someone is probably 3 or 4 miles in the Zion or in the rural communities and they do not have access to a medical practitioner, how do we deal with that? Because we have Nixon cronies. We only look at the people on the highways and byways. What about the people that you see this big concrete house on the hill and wonder how they got the material up there, but they do not have access to the road? Thank you.
Your herbalists would fall under allied health practitioners, and allied health practitioners are registered and licensed. In the current framework of the legislation, allied health practitioners would be free to operate completely within the Class 1 space.
Yes, just to add a little bit on what the brother said there. I know we spoke about traditional farmers, so I guess what we're talking about now is traditional healers. So they would be in that category of the allied healers and so on you spoke about?
Yes.
Traditional healers would be under there?
Yes.
Thank you.
In going through the bill, I noticed there were a few typo errors, and there's a section where they have certain conditions where cannabis can be prescribed for. So glaucoma actually appears twice in that section, so you'll have to delete one and of course renumber. But I wondered if the person who made the error actually has glaucoma, for which cannabis can be prescribed for, you know.
You have any other questions from the audience? Any other questions online, Mr. Harris?
We're looking at pricing. You know, my brother was just asking about what about pricing. So I was simply telling him it supply and demand. That was what would cause you to be able to be flexible in pricing.
That's correct. So the industry allows for supply and demand to dictate the price of the product. It is not envisaged that it would be artificially inflated by any other mechanism. But the legislation does allow the Minister of Responsibility for Cannabis, which is the Minister for Commerce, to set a price if it is that the CTE, for example, is acting in a way to inflate the price of cannabis. So the minister can step in that case and restrict or regulate the price of cannabis.
A question from our online audience. Are the dispensaries selling medicinal or recreational cannabis or both?
So there are 2 dispensaries, and just to understand the thinking behind the legislation, as the legislation is drafted, all cannabis being consumed by a human being is medicinal cannabis. So when you read through the bill, if it is that a human being is using that cannabis product, it is medicinal cannabis. The dispensaries are either Class 1 or Class 2 dispensaries. So a Class 1 dispensary can dispense Class 1 medicinal cannabis. A Class 2 dispensary must be a pharmacy and can dispense Class 1 or Class 2 medicinal cannabis. But also to note that Class 1 products are all finished products. So when you're going, for example, to buy Panadol, it's a sealed single packet of Panadol. If you are getting a prescription for a strong painkiller or strong pain medicine, when you go to the pharmacy, the pharmacist would then be dispensing a certain number of pills to you in a sachet. That is the difference in your class 1 products, which is a finished product where you can go in and say, I would like 1 packet of X. It is known to be a finished sealed product, as opposed to a prescribed product where you are breaking bulk as a pharmacist and determining that the doctor has prescribed this potency for this number of days to be taken this number of times, and that would be how it would be dispensed at the class 2 dispensaries.
Yes, question. I know from time to time, in fact, at many of forums where cannabis is being discussed, whether it be decriminalization or legalization, it has often been mentioned that the Rastafari community, you know, has to be given thanks and praise for them to keep who held up the banner for so long. Is the Rastafari community influence, you know, a lot of things in terms of the way people think now towards cannabis and so on. So basically, a lot of praises in different forums have been heaped on the Rastafari community. And does the legislation make any provision, special provisions, in terms of recognizing the contribution of the Rastafari community? And for want of a better word, is there a bit of a Bill of Rights in that legislation for the Rastafari community in particular, in recognizing their peculiar situation when it comes to cannabis as a product and as a substance? Is there any provisions carved into the legislation that speaks to the Rastafari community in particular?
So the Rastafarian community is recognized within the bill as a religious organization, and the traditional cultivators we spoke of earlier, the individuals who are able to obtain an amnesty and get preferential treatment for licenses, you can only do so as an individual or as a religious organization. So the Rastafarian community is allowed to apply, a tabernacle may apply for a cultivation license as a tabernacle under the traditional cultivator regime. So that's one. But outside of that, we also want persons to appreciate that the RSA is a regulator, and the legislation that is being drafted is a framework for regulated use of the product. So we recognize the trials and tribulations that our Rastafarian brethren have gone through, and we do believe that there are mechanisms that need to be put in place for the matters being discussed, like repatriatory justice, etc. But we do not believe it is best suited to find itself within a regulated act. So we would encourage the Rastafarian community to write to the powers that be and request the assistance and the concessionary treatment within the space of cannabis and outside of that space. But as a regulator, it would not be proper to have within the legislation that we are doing X, Y, or Z for that purpose.
I want also to ask, we talk about dispensaries. Interesting though. But we need to remember we have the guys on the block. The guys have been selling the 5-bag and 3 bags all their lives, and that's what they send the kids to school. Some of them have been marginalized also by the police. What provisions we have for these individuals? Those we see on the CDC, the little buckets, which you call them malls. You know, because you see, if we take them out of that space, may be a problem because they need to seek other employment. But that's a form of employment for them.
So the intention was not to take away their means of employment, but to venerate them to a standard. So we cannot say within the space that you will be allowed to have a mall, as you put it, with cannabis selling on the roadside. But that you would have been obviously a traditional operator, and if you applied for the amnesty and you were recognized as such, you then have the ability to be part of a central trading entity where you can benefit from the cannabis being sold on island. So that's one. So they're not ostracized by virtue of the fact that they had a mall, as you put it. In addition to that, there are many mechanisms that these persons can tap into as persons who intend to be legitimate business people. You could not have gone to the bank or to your credit union before and said, I want to have a mall selling Rizla and selling cannabis. What this framework allows for an individual to do is say, I want to be a legitimate business person and open up a dispensary. I'm not a pharmacy, so I cannot do class 2, but I can do class 1. I have this and that. Here's my business plan. I would like support from this credit union, this bank, in order to open a class 1 dispensary. What this regime allows for is these persons to have that level of access. So the individual who may have been processing the cannabis, who couldn't go to a bank to get that facility, he can now go to the Ministry of Commerce and say that there's a MSME loan grant facility where persons can get a loan grant to assist with their business enterprise. So these individuals are now in a position, since it is now a legitimate industry with a framework in place. You can say that I want my license, so I've gotten a license. Can I get that loan grant? I'm a young person. The ministry now exists to give assistance to young entrepreneurs. I can go to that ministry, to that department and say, I would like assistance. This is my business plan. I want to go into manufacturing cannabis products as a young person. I would like to benefit from the same assistance that somebody gets in another space or in another field. So that is what the legal cannabis industry and framework allows for. So again, we're not trying to malign these individuals. We're trying to see that they can venerate themselves to that level and standard that we put out to everyone.
Just to add to what you were saying, Dylan, as well, it's also about the safety of the consumers as well. So we cannot allow for the legalization of an activity and not have the checks and balances to ensure that the products that people are consuming are safe. So currently, in the current context with the bucket malls, there's nobody verifying that that product is safe for consumption. Under this regime, there is testing that would be taking place of all of the products before persons consume them to ensure that those products are safe for consumption. So persons who have those small malls, what they can do is look to form cooperatives to have their own dispensaries and be able to have product that is safe for consumption by the public. We have a question online before we go to you, Dr. Matthew. We'll go to you just next. One of the questions online is that with regards to banking with funds made from cannabis in any of the business aspects available by the RSA, it may be an issue because of the corresponding banks based in the US. While it is legal in some US states, on a state level, cannabis for the most part is illegal on a federal level. Source of funds need to be declared. So how will cultivators, dispensaries, etc., be able to deposit those funds into respective banks, specifically since dispensaries, for instance, will accept payment via card machines?
That's a good question. So in the early stages, as I said, when we were answering the question made by Pancho, we did look to a number of the international banks to ask what would be required of them. And we also spoke to our counterparts in St. Vincent who have an industry that currently is operating that allows for the banking of these funds. And we found that some of the requirements were somewhat onerous, but again, if we have no option, we have to fall in line with the requirements set by some of the entities willing to allow for us to have the regime on island. So we have had initial discussions with some of the correspondent banks to ensure that within the region we are safeguarded and they are satisfied. And there are mechanisms that we are rolling out as the industry rolls out. We'll be rolling out the requirements for banking, but we have the assurance from some of these international partners and international banks that we would be able to bank the funds.
Dr. Mann.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. It's a pleasure being here. I would like to say that these are three gentlemen I know very well, and I know to be very responsible professionals, men overall. So I think cannabis is in good hands. I probably have 3 cents that I'd like to add to the conversation. The first is the distinction being made between recreational and medicinal cannabis as if the two were mutually exclusive. I'm not too sure that it really is the case, you know. I mean, I go through my day suggesting to people that they need to recreate as one of the most important parts of maintaining their health. So recreation we understand to be important for stress management, and we know very well that if you don't manage your stress well enough, you can have effects on the cardiovascular system, on the neurological system. So my point is, recreational cannabis may be medicinal, number one. Number two, I think we need to bring the medical community into the conversation. I don't think the general public understands that when you go through med school and what you're told is that cannabis is bad because of A and B and C, and you get that drummed into your head, and then you go into an emergency room and then you see a patient come in with psychosis and you get a history of cannabis intoxication, and you see other things come up, and you especially things like COPD, you see these patients who suffer so much from these conditions, you tell yourself, nah man, it cannot be safe. As a physician, I think many of us still struggle with accepting that cannabis is safe to recommend. Your conversation, I must say, has already opened the minds of many of us, and I could start to see the change in the medical literature, but I'm not sure that everybody is on the same page. So we need to have that conversation about where is cannabis safe. For example, are we saying that we need to identify persons with a predisposition to psychiatric conditions and tell them, hey, cannabis may not be safe for you? Should it be a situation where we should say clearly and plainly that smoking is bad? So, hey, you could use cannabis, but don't smoke at all. Don't smoke it. Don't smoke paper. The lungs were made for clean, fresh air. Don't smoke. Should we be saying these things louder so that the medical community starts to say, okay, we can get involved in this conversation in a way where we feel like we're not saying anything that's going to be harmful to persons. And the third thing I just want to add here is maybe the information needs to be louder. So I'm going to add something which may be a bit controversial here and say maybe we should use things like the wall that is opposite the Compre and say, do not smoke, including, and maybe in little letters, including cannabis and this and that, but no smoking. I think I would like to see that on that wall instead of what it is currently being used for.
Just to touch one quick point in response to you, Doc. I'm an attorney at law, and I've had a considerable background in regulation in enterprise development. You are my doctor. And if it is that I am to use class 2 medicinal cannabis, you would be the one to prescribe, and you'd be the one to advise me as to how I should utilize it. So I've seen in certain jurisdictions, in Barbados, for example, where there's been a stance that the legislation needs to prohibit the smoking of cannabis. And in my conversation with the practitioners there, I said, so you don't have any respect for the physicians in your country? Why should the legal drafters determine if it is that the person should consume the plant by smoking? That's not my place as a drafter. You have gone to school and studied that. So if it is that the physicians believe that no smoking should take place, they won't prescribe it for smoking. If they don't prescribe it, then the pharmacies will not stock it. It's supply and demand. So if it is that the conversation takes place and you educate yourself as a physician and you determine that the literature now shows I can prescribe cannabis for these ailments and it is best utilized in these ways and that is how it should be administered. When you have a patient that comes before you as the doctor and you say, listen, I'm going to put you on cannabis. Doc, on cannabis? Yes. But you're going to take it by way of tincture. You're going to drop 2 drops under your... This is how you're going to take it. Then I am going to trust you as my doctor as I do with every other prescription. And I've been prescribed narcotics before. I've been prescribed very strong products. And I have taken it, and that is how the doctor said I should take it. I shouldn't drive. I shouldn't operate heavy equipment. I shouldn't this. I shouldn't do that. Cannabis is no different. So should people be smoking cannabis? I won't answer that question. But if it is that you have class 2 cannabis and I see you smoking class 2 flower, I will assume that your doctor has said to you that you ought to be smoking cannabis. Maybe because of the method of delivery, that it is quicker than if you were to have taken it orally. So you take it orally and then you smoke and you wait. So that will allow for the bridging between the time that you have the pain now and when it kicks in from the... That's for the doctor to see. But our legislation allows the physician to make that determination. And we would hope that they would guide their patients accordingly.
We have a question from online. Mr. Norbert Inglis, you mentioned the amnesty provision. Are there any conditions that would create a situation where amnesty cannot be applied?
Well, the amnesty is in the current draft of the legislation for a period determined by the Minister of Justice. So the Minister of Justice has the ability to allow for an amnesty for up to 1 year, recognizing the timeline for the propagation of the plant. That if it is 6 months that the amnesty period is for, an individual can come forward and apply for the amnesty within that period of time. The field officers of the RSA would visit the site where you indicate that you either have the product or you were cultivating, etc., and you would have to satisfy the board of the RSA that you would have met the criteria that is being developed now for the amnesty. So I do not know that we have a set criteria that will determine that you are not or you are a traditional cultivator, but there would be an investigation which would give rise to that.
So one follow-up question on the amnesty is that is the amnesty for a lifetime?
The amnesty covers the product that you have at that time. So I was cultivating cannabis and I have 62 plants. I've obtained an amnesty, and for these 62 plants I will not be arrested and charged. You are now in a position to apply for a cultivation license as somebody recognized as a traditional cultivator can now apply for a cultivator's license and cultivate legally with your cultivator's license if it is given. But again, we recognize that you may have gotten an amnesty to cultivate in where you were cultivating, sorry, in the forest reserve. The RSA cannot give you a license to continue to cultivate in the forest reserve. So we can recognize that you had these 62 plants in the forest reserve and you will not be arrested and charged for that. But if you would like to continue to cultivate, you will apply for a license. If that license is approved in a space where you can cultivate, where you have received permission to cultivate and it is legal so to do, then you get that license, you can continue your cultivation. But the recognition as a traditional cultivator when you receive the amnesty, that is for a lifetime.
Yeah, well, it's obvious from the bill that weighing is critical to the trade and also the enforcement of the bill or the law. So the Bureau of Standards, we actually recommend that persons use legal for trade scales. Those are scales that have gone through a process of approval to ensure that they provide reliable and accurate measurement for their lifespan. And also to the legal for trade scales have provisions for sealing, so the Bureau can actually do a verification and seal the device to ensure that if anybody uses a transaction, uses a scale for trade of marijuana, that the transaction is actually fair both from the supplier and the user's perspective, to prevent fraud. Okay? And we provide specifications to the public on what kind of scales to use.
Thanks for that.
So we'll take 2 more questions from the audience and 1 more from online that we already have.
Yes, I want to go back to that amnesty because I think we need it now. What do we do right now in terms of applying for an amnesty? Because, I mean, from the Rastafari community, we do, so we need amnesty now because we don't want the police to move in on us as we speak. We have stuff in the ground. So, I mean, it's a real situation. So, what do we do? What can we do at this stage to declare what we have, where we have it, and for us to apply for that amnesty right away?
So, as I said, the amnesty is part of the Cannabis and Industrial Hemp Bill. When that bill is an act, it would allow an individual to make that application. What you can do at this stage is what you're doing now. Be as vocal as possible and assist us in curating a bill that is best suited. So when we started drafting the legislation, we didn't have an amnesty originally. But in forums like this, we had those conversations and we included provisions like that. If it is that we do not get sufficient support or sufficient buy-in or sufficient comments, then we're not certain if we're moving in the right direction. So if we can get feedback, we can get comments, we can get the concerns that we can address in the bill, then we can have a bill that can be brought before Parliament in short order. And when that bill is brought before Parliament and enacted, then you would have had the Minister of Justice allowing for that amnesty period.
So we cannot get no protection at this point?
Well, the RSA is not in a position to give you that protection at this point.
Okay, so what would the RSA advise? Who could we apply to?
There is no individual that you can apply to. What you are allowed to cultivate at this stage is 4 plants in your household and to be in possession of 30 grams.
We're speaking about the cultivators and their traditional license and the amnesty. What about the people who are selling the herb? Can they apply for a traditional cultivator's license even though they're not involved in cultivation, but they're involved in distribution? So would they require the inspector to come, and they might have a pound of ganja that they're going to be putting in 5 bags, so the inspector will have to see and verify that this guy is actually a juggler, and as a result, he's entitled to a traditional cultivator license?
So the way that the legislation is drafted currently, it is not only for individuals who are currently cultivating, but persons who are in possession of cannabis. So the persons who are in possession may also apply for the amnesty. We've recognized that the nomenclature is a little bit off. So it references persons, even if they are in possession, it still references them as traditional cultivators, which they may not have been. As you said, they may have been jugglers. So in our review, there has been discussion surrounding maybe the change to the nomenclature. So maybe we look at traditional cannabis operators as opposed to cultivators to include persons like that. But that is something that came out from these engagements and something that we're currently considering for inclusion.
We'll take the last question from the audience because you are that enthusiastic, and then close off with the online question.
Yeah, interesting. Cannabis trading within the region. While in St. Vincent, in the conferences, I mentioned that there is so much red tape with international trade. And I realize we have not even mastered national and regional trade. We also had an article that came out from the Guardian newspaper with SVG, medical authorities, and the Caribbean Cannabis Fair Trade Working Group. And we're talking about, before we think about looking at the money abroad, let's look at the money within the region. Because we look at the situation with COVID and with post-COVID, we need to start growing the economy of the countries within the region. If we realize America has gone dictatorship with Donald Trump, what are we going to do? We need to bring the Caribbean together and work together within the space that we have to be able to know that we could trade within the region. So since we have an entity that comprises of the different organizations when it comes to cannabis within the region, I think that is worth looking at, because we will move cannabis, we'll move goods and products and services, because remember, we are signatories to treaties of movement of people within the region. It's not happening because the politicians cannot do it. Civil society have to do it. And that's an area that we can work on. Because within the Caribbean, within the space in the Caribbean, we know areas that have cannabis and don't have. So we need to service the region. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that.
So the last question from the online. How soon can we start applying? We, the farmers, have been waiting. When will the bill be passed? And in the interim, can persons/companies come in to apply for licenses?
So the framework legally to apply for a license is pursuant to the legislation. So the RSC cannot accept or process a license application or approve a license until we have the legal basis so to do. I am not the Attorney General, nor am I the Prime Minister, so I am not in a position to dictate what goes to Parliament when. What I can indicate is there is definitely an appetite and interest in having the legislation brought before Parliament at the soonest. So the quicker we are able to get feedback from the public so that we can send to the Attorney General's chambers with the comments on the bill to indicate these are the comments coming out from our stakeholder engagements. That is what the public is saying. The bill is perfect. Nothing is to be changed. We need to tweak this. The CTE needs to be amended. The amnesty they don't like. The quicker we get that information from the public, the quicker we can send a memorandum to the AG's chambers to tweak the bill accordingly. The quicker the bill is tweaked, the quicker it goes to Parliament. So again, I cannot give the timelines, but I can say what we need to do in earnest is give the feedback on the legislation that has been published for the public to give comment on since January.
And with that, we've come to the end of our symposium on cannabis. There are a few light refreshments outside, so please feel free to, like they say in other spaces, network with one another, and thank you for being with us.